Stitch, thank you very much for being on the podcast. That's a great honor.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's a nice way to spend the day during this lockdown, kind of change your whole personality and everything that goes with that. So I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, I was surprised that you already lockdown is no longer in place where are you, in Las Vegas, or where is it?
Yeah. I'm in Las Vegas, and I've been staying home like everybody. So it's nice, got a nice house and got a nice backyard and I have a nice wife. So for me, it's like a holiday.
Well, just like most famous Cutman should have. Let's talk about you, Stitch, and let's start with, tell us what's primary duty of the Cutman.
Well, at the end of the day, the job of a Cutman is to basically give that fighter that one more round. And in doing that, let me start off. Here's what happens is when I work with a fighter, my thing is, number one, to get the mental game going, because you're a gladiator. You got to know that I'm there to take care of you. So once the fighter gets into the dressing room, my job is to wrap his hands, in theory, so they don't break them. And then come the fight time, my job is, if he gets cut, is to maintain the cuts. If he gets swollen, maintain the swelling, and give him every chance to win a fight. But, I'm like a father figure when I work with these guys, because even though they're modern-day gladiators, deep inside, everybody's still a baby, and I know that.
I remember seeing like footage of you wrapping hands of the fighters and you talking to them, and it seems like you're almost calming them down before the fight. And I actually read a few of them was saying that when you show up in the room, it's kind of their stomach comes down. They realize where they are and what's happening. Tell me about that aspect.
That was a great quote from Frank Mir.
Yes.
He says, when you Stitch walking into the dressing room, my stomach just drops because I know it's time to fight. And that's really the first step of going into battle. I've also, Vitor Belfort, he says, when I see Stitch walking into the dressing room, even though I know he's fighting, he's in the other corner, he brings that calming effect. And in doing that, then that's what I give to these people.
You've spent quite a bit of time doing this. I'm curious, this is not something you study for, right? Is it self-taught craft?
Yeah, that's a good question, because when I first started, I asked this guy, I told him, I said, look, I'm trying to learn how to be a cut man. Can you tell me what you did? And he says, F you. He goes, I'm taking this to my grave and you got to learn just like me. But see, in those days, these cutmen thought it was a secret and that they were going to take it to their grave. I felt about this big when he told me that. But I learned a lesson that I'm never going to be like this guy. So my job is to go out there and teach, but there's no schools. I've done seminars. I have doctors, I have paramedics, I have nurses, I have EMTs, I have housewives. Everybody sees what we do. Now everybody wants to be a cut man, and I tell them it takes more than that. You got to spend hours and days and weeks and months and years in the gym, training like a fighter and getting into the mental game of a fighter. But it's a very rewarding job.
Do you have apprentice or something? How does it work? Like, you can't go from gym to the big stage, or can you?
Well, yeah, I've taught people, but I don't really call them apprentice, because I said, I'll show you the basic foundation. You have to create your own clientele. Just because you learn from me doesn't make you good. You still got to go and practice. You still got to go and do what you have to do. So in that aspect, yeah, I've taught guys, but then at that point, you have to open up your own doors and create your own clients and continue giving back. You always have to give back to the system, and wrapping hands, learning how, because wrapping hands is a technique that you have to understand how a fighter feels. If his knuckles are hurt, let's say his metacarpals are hurt, his thumb, his wrist, you got to know how to handle those type of injuries. And then, like the mental game, you got to make sure you relax them.
I know that you used to work with individual boxers, but you also worked with the organizations like UFC. Do you approach each boxer and ask them, and walk us through that part?
I've been very blessed. I've never asked for one job till this day. I've been real blessed. People have called me. I'm just a little proud Mexican that I just can't go over there and kiss nobody's ass, right? So they come to me. But when it comes to boxing, the fighter actually brings me in and they hire me. to work with that specific fighter. When it comes to MMA, and now I'm doing bare knuckle fights. When it comes to MMA and bare knuckle fights, the promoters are the one that brings me in, and then they're the ones that pay me, and then I work with all the fighters. So I try to be neutral, and I try to help them out.
You mentioned bare knuckles fights. Those guys have terrible cuts. I remember there was a conversation about having boxing gloves actually hurts boxers because they are able to hit very hard. But then bare knuckle fighting came in, and you see this horrible cuts on the people. How do you deal with those? And how do you compare the working for, let's say, bare knuckle fights versus MMA and versus boxing?
That's a good question. You know, bare knuckle fights, I found out just through my own personal surveys that 60-70% of these guys are going to get cut. They know it. I know it. I think that's why the fans really like it, because they know it. But I always prepare for the worst case scenario, and the same thing with MMA, and the same thing with boxing. But with boxing, the cuts are less. MMA, the cuts, you know, you get multiple cuts, but their cuts are a lot deeper because you got the elbows, you got the knees, you have the ground and pound. In the bare knuckle fights, they're multiple also, but they're not as deep. It's what they call short-term injuries, where you sew it up, you could take care of it and be ready to go in another, 4 or 5 months.
Have you ever been in a fight when you saw this deep cuts and you were thinking to yourself, like, holy moly, I don't know what I'm going to do with this thing?
Of course. I think, damn, and we have a saying that, let's say me and this other cutman are working, and the other cutman has a real bad cut. We always say it's better you than me, but no, there's of course, there's cuts that you look at that you're thinking, all right, wow, this is pretty serious. We got to take care of it. But I always try to keep positive, because if you look nervous, the fighter's going to know that you're nervous, so I kind of mess around with them, joke around with them that, you're fine. And maybe I'll slap him in the face and let him get going and take that out of his mind. But yeah, and the bottom line, if the cut is going to be so bad that the fight should be stopped, then I would recommend that, because my job is to protect the fighter.
Do you ever watch fight on TV or maybe in arena and you see the cutman doing something wrong?
All the time, brother. My kids grew up in the sport. They understand the work that I do. I'll get a text from them, Dad, did you see this guy? What the things that bug me so much as Snore is when the guys put the swabs in their mouth and they put them in their ear, and the technique is bad. And yeah, of course, I study everybody. Even if it's a 4-round fight, I'll study the applications that Cutman make. And then some guys that are friends, I'll make recommendations. I said, look, you did a good job, but here's how you could do a better job. Because I don't work on legals. I work on making this game safer for everybody, for the fans, for the fighters, of course, the promoters, but just to make it safe. And it's a hurt business, so my whole loyalty has been to take care of these guys.
So obviously most of the stuff is more like a scientific, where when you see cut, you pretty much know how to deal with it. But what aspect of it where you have to improvise? Like, we've never seen a cut like this, for example. Like, I remember, I think Forrest Griffin had like a very weird cut that you figure out how to deal with it on the spot.
Yeah, well, Forrest Griffin's it's pretty basic cut type of thing, but there's some cuts. That's another good question. There's some cuts you just have to ad-lib as you get on it. There's, one cut, you get the cauliflower ears of these MMA fighters.
Mm-hmm.
You split that open, how are you going to work on that? Robbie Lawler, when he fought Roy McDonald,
oh my God, yeah,
just split open, right? And so those aren't your normal type of injuries. So common sense, cold, direct pressure, medications, so you try to apply as much as you can and take care of it as much as you can. And you're talking about, I'll tell you a story with Stefan Struve. When he fought this guy, Chris, I can't even remember the guy's last name. His lip was shredded to the point he looked like a shark just bit it. So I'm working on him, and he still wants to continue fighting. And even though the cut doesn't look bad, or the cut looks bad, it's not giving the fighter a disadvantage. And when a doctor and a referee stops a fight, it's because the fighter is at a disadvantage. So Stefan Struve wanted to continue to fight, and the doctor's working on him, And he said, well, I'm working on him. The doctor's looking in. And I tell the doctor, I said, look, if you got a good plastic surgeon, he's going to be okay. Let the fight continue. And he let the fight continue, and he ended up winning the fight.
That's great. I'm sure all the fighters appreciative that you prevented from fight being stopped, because then they go in and actually win the fight. That's fantastic. So you've worked with some of the most famous boxers and MMA fighters, and I want to speak with you a little bit about each. Okay, so tell me a little bit about your work with Klitschko brothers.
Yeah, that was a big honor for me. But this goes back to like 1991, December the 12th, 1991. I say 91, Vitaly says 92, when the Soviet Union first broke.
Yeah.
We took a team of professional boxers and kickboxers to Kiev, to Ukraine, to fight against the Ukrainian fighters. I had a kickboxer at that time. The Klitschko brothers were young kids at that time, but they were very famous. There were big billboards, big posters with them, and I saw them at the fights, but I never really met them. And then they came and they trained here in Las Vegas, and I introduced myself to them, and I told them that I was at these fights in Kiev, and I brought the poster, and they recognized everybody, right? And so that's how we started being in touch. And then when the movie Ocean's 11 came, Vladimir was fighting Lennox Lewis, Vitaly was in the corner. I happened to be the cut man for Vladimir. So that was cool, you know. And then we're doing some fights. Emmanuel Stewart was commentating for HBO. And we're at the MGM, there's some fights, and he has his tuxedo on, and he's walking by, and he says, Stitch, he goes, I need to talk to you about working with Vladimir. So I look at my partner, and I say, did you see what I saw? So the next day he called me and says, would you be interested in working with Vladimir? Of course. Took me a split second to say yes. So I ended up working with Vladimir, and then Vitaly finished his retirement and came out of retirement. And in that point, I started working with him. First fight that I worked with him was here in Las Vegas at Caesar's Palace. He fought Devera Williamson, all right? So I'm outside watching the fights, and Vladimir's in the dressing room. He's warming up and all that. And one of the guys comes and says, hey, we need you in the dressing room. Vladimir punched himself. He had a bloody nose, so I had to work on him before the fight even started, right? So during the fight, you know, he had just come back from losing his world title to Layman Brewster. So he won the first 3 rounds. And then in the 4th round, he gets dropped with a simple shot. Though I knew he was still winning the fight. So that's why you have to know every aspect of the game. In the 5th round, he gets an unintentional headbutt. He gets that cut right there. And I look at it, and I've worked on those cuts before. That was a Forrest Griffith cut. But I knew at that point he wasn't looking great, but he was winning the fight. He had a bad cut. So as he came and sat down, I told Vladimir and Vitaly, I said, look, you're winning the fight. You got a bad cut. I'm going to have the doctor stop the fight. So when the doctor came, they said, well, what do you think, Stitch? I go like this, and I open up the cut. They stopped the fight. It went to the scorecards. Vladimir ended up winning the fight, and shortly after that became the heavyweight champion of the world. So that was not a bad start.
Yeah, not at all. Andre Ward is next on my list of questions. What do you remember about working with Andre Ward?
Well, you know, we were both from Oakland, and I knew Andre when he was a young kid. And he always told me, you know, Stitch, when I go pro, I want you to be my cut man. Yeah, of course, you know, sure. Well, when Andre Ward went pro, he called me to be his cut man. So I worked every fight with Andre. I think there was 2 fights I didn't work because I had already had a visa to go to work some UFC fights, and I didn't want to cancel that. It wasn't fair to the UFC. So I missed those, but the rest of them I worked with him, and what a pleasure working with him. Good kid. You know, I've been fortunate enough to say that I've worked with some of the best fighters in the world and some of the nicest fighters in the world.
And currently in boxing world, I think you're working with Tyson Fury.
Yeah, that was a different world. You know, I got called to work with him. Of course, you know that the big fight was when the rematch with Deontay Wilder.
Yes.
You know, he got the big cut the fight before, so they brought me in to work with him, and I met him 2 weeks before the fight, and we sat down and we talked about the cuts and everything, and about sponsorships and all that. And I did like 40, 50 interviews that week, brother. Everybody was concerned about the cut. And I told them, I did the bare knuckle fights like the week before in Florida, and I did a bunch of interviews there about the cut and how I got called to work with Tyson Fury. So I get back to the gym Monday, and I said, I did a bunch of interviews, Tyson, and everybody was concerned about the cut except you and I. And he said, yeah, he goes, I'm not concerned about the cut. So that was a good compliment on my part.
Was that cut during his fight with Otto Wallen treated correctly, you think?
No, there was I met with Jorge Capetillo, is a good friend of mine. And he's a novice, and what he did, he's a novice, and he just got thrown into something that he wasn't 100% prepared with. So, yeah. But he did enough to take him the distance and to give him a victory. And like I told him, I said, you represented the Cutman with pride, plus you represented the Mexicans, with pride. But here's some of the things that you could do better on the next one. But it turned out that when Tyson Fury was going to fight Deontay Wilder, Jorge Capetillo was one of the guys that recommended me to work with Tyson, because he told Tyson he has a lot more experience for these type of fights, which, I thought that was quite honorable on his part.
Yeah, it's definitely. You've worked with UFC quite some time ago. Who were some most memorable fighters you worked with?
Vanderlei Silva, Anderson Silva, Mirko CroCop. Oh, yeah. And let me tell you a story about Mirko CroCop, because that just came up the other day. Fedor Emelianenko. But when Mirko used to fight in Pride, he was a prima donna. He always stayed in a different hotel. When he got on the scale, and got off and left. And so I never really spoke to him. But when he signed with the UFC, he requested me to wrap his hands. I said, Mirko CroCop, of course, So I go, after the weigh-ins, we go into the dressing room. I think we're at the Mandalay Bay here in Las Vegas. And I wrap his hands, and my daughter's there, and she's a big Mirko CroCop fan. And we take a picture. I cut the wraps off and give it to my daughter. So she has Mirko hand wraps. Fedor Emelianenko, Cain Velasquez, Anderson Silva. I worked with every one of these guys. You name them, I worked with them.
Yeah, and one interesting thing I saw, that you also work with the YouTuber KSI.
Yeah, that was a different world. I didn't know who KSI was. I didn't know who Logan Paul was, but they both had like 20 million followers. I didn't even know that was even available. So they called me to work with KSI, and, for me it was economics. He came to Las Vegas, and we started training, and, sit down like I'm looking at you, I'm wrapping his hands. I said, I don't even know who you are, what you do, but here you're a fighter, and I'm going to treat you like you're a fighter. But it turns out that it was a great, great experience, because you could see the transition go from, he was like a cocoon turned into a butterfly, but from a cocoon, he turned into a fighter. And if about the 4th or 5th week, I said, you know what, I'm going to knight you as a fighter, because you're doing everything right, just like a fighter. And then I ended up working with Gib when he fought Jake Paul. And the same thing, even though Gib was not an athlete like KSI, but he showed the heart of a warrior. And just see these guys to go from their world into our world was very respectful. And I got a lot of respect for both of them.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I saw that the numbers they made, it's very significant. It's crazy.
I don't know what the numbers were, but I know it made a whole lot of sense for DAZN, because they work on a subscription base, right? And if you get 40 million additional people that know that these guys are fighting, some of them are going to tune in. And if you get 1% of the 40 million, you did pretty good.
Yeah. There are a couple of things I wanted to kind of get your professional opinion on. Did you by chance see the fight of Nate Diaz versus Jorge Masvidal some time ago when Diaz got cut?
Yeah, I didn't see the whole fight, but I saw the end results.
Mm-hmm.
And, the question was, should that fight have continued, right? I think that's the question you probably want to ask, right?
Correct.
That's a question that's been asked before. It should have, it could have. And, that's why it's important when you go to a different state, a new commission. I always like to sit and talk to the doctors and let them know that here's what we do. Give us these opportunities. But, I've worked in New York before, and they're very cautious on what they do. And But as you look at the experience factor now, those aren't what you call cuts that would give a fighter a disadvantage. The blood wasn't getting into his eyes. It was
Yeah.
an effect. Even though it looked bad, it didn't mean that it was bad. So,
Got it. One other thing is like old story. I'm sure you know it, and I'm sure you've seen it. It's do you remember that fight with Antonio Margarito when he got caught with some controversial thing? Do you think it was possible for Antonio not to know about the raps?
no.
Okay, no.
When that happened, ESPN contacted me and they wanted my opinion, and I'll give you my opinion on how our process goes, and you tell me. So the process of a cut man, whenever let's say Antonio Margarito, world champion, Andre Ward, world champion. What I do is I prepare everything. I'll get the tape and I'll lay it out. I'll get the gauze and I'll make the padding. I'll put them there. So when you come and sit down with me, everything is already on the table. So what happened with Margarito is they're going through the process, and his coach reaches in his bag and he brings out the padding that goes there. Well, we don't do that as the norm. I don't know anybody that's ever done that. That was the clicker that caught the attention of these guys and said, no, you know what? Let's check out those pads. Did Antonio Margarito know about it? Chances are highly probable.
That's interesting. I mean, I think this is what everybody thought.
Yeah, of course.
Getting your expertise is interesting. Jacob, I want to know more about you as a person. Where were you born and where did you grow up?
Yeah, well, let's start off. I was born in the San Joaquin Valley of California. I was born, I was raised in a migrant camp. I was a farm worker all my life till I joined the military. But I was born and raised, I lived in a migrant camp till I was like in the second gate. And then I moved like 4 miles away to a little town called Planada, which was my base. But when I got out of high school, I always wanted to play American baseball. And when I got out of high school, I walked on to Merced College, and Merced College was like 9 miles away from my hometown. I didn't have a car, so I would go to school with friends, and after school, they would go home, and I would stay and I'd practice with the team, and then I'd have to hitchhike back home. And I did that for a while, and I didn't know about grants and scholarships or talking to my coach or anything. So I joined the Air Force. It was 1972. And so I joined the Air Force, and in 1974, they stationed me in a place called Thailand. I was a young kid. I didn't even know what Thailand was, but I knew that if I went to the Orient, that I always wanted to study the martial arts. And I saw my first Muay Thai fight. That whole year, I dedicated my life and soul to the martial arts. And when I got back to the States, I got into boxing just to improve my hands. And then I opened up my own school of kickboxing with a credit card and started training fighters. And from there, it grew up to this. So, there's that thing of always, if you're scared to try it, cross that line and go and do it. For me to open up my own school with just a credit card, that was crazy. But I was a trainer. I was already recognized as a trainer. So the school right off the bat turned out to be pretty good. So
I think you also tried yourself a little bit as a promoter and an agent, probably for the same students. How was that experience?
I promoted fights. I teamed up. The first show that I promoted was with a college baseball team. And we co-promoted, and we did the show at Solano College. And then I did, first before that, when I lived in Oakland, I promoted an amateur show in Oakland for boxing. But then when I was in Fairfield, California, like I say, I did a promotion with the baseball team of the college, and then with Travis Air Force Base. I promoted 2 shows there, and I challenged everything, man. So I've done it all, and I was a manager, I was a trainer, Cutman. So I understand everything. I understand the mentality of a manager, of a trainer, of a promoter, of an agent, of a fighter, So I understand the mental parts of what goes on with this whole system that we work.
At what point you decided to become a cutman?
When I had my school of kickboxing, I did it for economic reasons. Plus, I wanted to know all aspects of the game. But yeah, when I was training kickboxers, and the name Stitch, that's not one of the questions you were going to ask, but maybe you were. I'll tell you how the name Stitch came. I was working with Dennis Alexio. Dennis Alexio was the kickboxing champion. If you remember the movie Bloodsport. So what happened is Dennis Alexio was the light heavyweight champion. Great athlete for ISKA. And one of his sparring partners, Dave Rooney, fought on the same card. And Dave Rooney ended up with now that I know cuts, he ended up with a small cut. And I used to see the old Cutman would get pieces of tape and make a butterfly. So I put a butterfly, two or three butterflies on it. And he says, "Oh man, you saved me some stitches. I'm going to call you Stitch." So that's where the name came from. And, you know, to this day, Dave Rooney, last time I heard, he was a fisherman somewhere in Alaska. And I don't think he knows how much he changed my life.
So, and from that point on, you thought, okay, maybe this is something for me to do. Is it how it?
Yeah, you know, I love being a trainer, and I was a very good trainer. I love being a trainer, but when I made the move to Las Vegas, you know, I worked corporate America. I had a corporate America job, so I worked 8 to 5, a company car, and you know, I was getting paid some good money, but I always wanted to challenge Las Vegas. It's the boxing capital of the world. So I put in for a job transfer, and I waited for about a year, and I knew we were downsizing, so I knew that eventually something was going to happen. Well, I get a call, and they said, "Look, there's an opening in Las Vegas, but you got to be there in a week." I said, "Well, shit, I can't be there in a week." So I called the manager, and he gave me 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, I'm telling you, I transferred my school to a student. I sold my house. I put my family in a U-Haul, and I drove 9 hours to Las Vegas. And then to top it off, I took a secondary position, which is like $25,000 a year less. But I wanted to go and challenge the world and be there. So when I got there, I went solely as a cut man. But I was in the gyms, and I'm looking at these trainers train, and I said, I could do that, and I could do that, and I could do that. So I started training fighters, but I couldn't give them 150% because I had an 8 to 5 job. So I concentrated on being a cut man.
At what point you start getting the inbound interest in you? When did people start hiring you?
Well, right off the bat. See, when I moved to Las Vegas, I had a lot of experience in kickboxing. People didn't realize that when I moved to Las Vegas, thinking, "Who is this guy?" But I had worked a lot of cuts. I'd wrapped a lot of hands in kickboxing, and I had worked with some boxers. And the first world title fight that I worked with, Tony the Tiger Lopez from Sacramento against Julio Cesar Chavez in Mexico. That was when I lived in California. So when I moved to Las Vegas, I started getting work right off the bat, you know. So that worked out to my advantage.
It's widely known that fighters in the gym perform differently than they perform on the actual stage. Is it the same for you as a cutman? Did you get nervous when the first world title and all the slides on you?
No more. You know, I don't know if nervous was the word, more of the adrenaline. You know, I'm to the point where I could control my adrenaline. Of course, you know, it's honor. It's a big thing to be in such a big show like the Tyson Fury, Deontay Wilder. You know, just adrenaline is what keeps us going, and that's what makes it. That's what makes it real fun for us. But yeah, nervous. Nah, those days are gone.
There are a few people in boxing that kind of represent boxing as a sport almost for the mainstream. When there is a movie about boxing, and it's very common to have Michael Buffer, you, and Joe Cortez in the ring because it actually represents the sport. And you've been in several Hollywood movies, so I want to talk to you a little bit about them.
Sure.
When was the first time somebody reached out to you asking to be in a movie?
I've been in 6 movies. The first one was Played to the Bone with Antonio Banderas and Woody Harrelson. But what happened there, like I said, I was with R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, and I was leaving the company at that time, but I get a call that they want me to go audition for a movie. And that was the day, my last day of working. And I'm working with my manager, and I'm nervous because the audition is at 3 o'clock, and we work from 8 to 5, and I was very disciplined. But about 10 o'clock, I tell Augie, the manager, I said, "Look, man, I got an audition to be in a movie. You know, it's at 3 o'clock. He goes, "Hey, I'm just here to check you out." So, boom, 11 o'clock, I'm done. So I go to, I think, Palace Station, one of the casinos here, and I did an audition. I got the part, and I was a cut man for Woody Harrelson, Played to the Bone. So that was the first one. And the second one that I did was Ocean's 11, Vladimir Klitschko, Vitaly Klitschko, right? Lennox Lewis. And I got to meet, Brad Pitt, Julia Roberts, Andy Garcia, George Clooney, all these superstars. I got to meet them, Matt Damon. And then the third one that I did was Balboa. Rocky Balboa. Rocky fought his last fight. I was in the corner with Antonio Tarver, Mason the Lion Dixon. Then I did Here Comes the Boom with Kevin James, Salma Hayek, Henry Winkler. That was a fun MMA movie. And then I did Creed 1 and Creed 2. So I've been real blessed with that.
Also, one interesting thing about that, I didn't watch Creed 2 yet because I really want to. But I saw the picture when the Drago's son basically facing Michael Jordan Jr. and he looks to be like twice the size of him. Is he that big? Is it like other in different weight classes? What was the deal with that?
Yeah. He was a little bit bigger than Michael B. Jordan, but and the same thing. He was an amateur boxer. He's Romanian, but he's born and raised in Germany, I think Munich. Amateur boxer that they discovered, and he did a tremendous job. So and we all became friends after that.
And so, with working with all these Hollywood personalities, who was the most memorable? Can you share your experience with that work?
Yeah, well, how can it not be Sylvester Stallone, right?
Yeah.
Especially what I do, and going into he comes into my world, I go into his world. But there was a couple great moments that was nice, and the first one when I got the script for Creed, I'm looking at my role as a Cutman, and my name was Marcel. Well, I don't know anybody named Marcel, so I'm thinking, well, I'm gonna have to figure out how to change this and all that. But when it was time for Rocky to introduce us to Adonis, he goes, Sylvester Stallone, he goes, oh, this is Stitch. He's the best cut man in Philadelphia. Man, I'm deep inside, I'm thinking, yes, he called me by my name, So the next day, we're at the gym, we're filming, and I said, Sly, I just want to let you know, I want to thank you for using my name. He goes, no, it has to be authentic, and that was kind of nice, and then there was another moment where I told her, I said, I can't sleep at nights. Here I am in Philadelphia for 6 weeks. I'm doing a movie with Sylvester Stallone, Michael B. Jordan, Ryan Coogler, the young director. Wow, what am I doing here? And he said, you know what? He goes, you earned it. And at that time, I said, you know what? He's absolutely right. I earned it. But a lot of great moments. Michael B. Jordan, Kevin James, and Kevin James. I'll tell you the story with him. On Here Comes the Boom, I didn't have a line. And the thing, and when you do movies, if you have lines, you get residuals, where the checks keep coming and coming every time they show them to a network or overseas or video. So there's always what they call mailbox money. So once again, I'm thinking, I got to do something. I got to say something. But when it was time for me and Kevin James to do our scene, he pulls me aside and he says, Stitch, we got to have you say something, which I thought was nice because it takes money out of their budget, right? So I'm playing the dumb part, and I said, well, here's what I tell the fighters. It's welcome to the UFC. Oh, yeah, no, that's great. All right. So the scene starts. They call me in. He gets cut. He sits down. They call me in. I start working on him, and I think his lines are, oh, Stitch, I'm a big fan of yours. I can't believe you're working on me. What a week I'm having. So I'm working on him, and then I slap him, bam, well, welcome to the UFC, and then I walk away. That was my $1 million line. But
it wasn't the script, right? You didn't slap wasn't there.
That was it, but the thing about it, I didn't want to tell him that I was going to slap him because I didn't want him to jerk or anything like that. And it was a one take, and they loved it. Everybody laughed, and I still get residual checks. In fact, I just got international checks from Here Comes the Boom the other day, so thank you, Kevin James.
That's very cool. I didn't know about these residual checks. Yeah, I'll just shout random stuff on the stage. Anyway, so with all these actors, I don't think any of them actually have fighting experience, right? None of them are trained boxers.
No.
Who do you think was able to catch up to the boxing, like become more or less authentic?
Michael B. Yeah, Michael B. Jordan, no doubt about it. Going from an actor into boxing. And the same thing, I knighted him as a fighter because he did such a tremendous job. technique-wise, you look good. I mean, the fight scenes were tremendous, you know, and so I got to say Michael B. Jordan.
There are many things that are regarding your life that are documented, and I think you have two biographies written about you by someone else. It's From the Fields to the Garden,
Yes.
First and second books. Tell us about these books, and how is the first different from the second?
Yeah, well, I co-authored that with Zach Robinson. And, you know, like I say, I've never asked for a job. You know, we mentioned that before. So what had happened is during the era when Randy Couture and Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell and Matt Hughes, they were having books written on them. I went out to dinner with the author for Matt Hughes and my wife and I about writing a book, you know, and I'm the kind of guy that if you want to do it, let's do it. Well, he never called back, you know, so that happens. Well, Zach Robinson is an American, but he lives in Germany, and he's a teacher for the military kids. And he's also written some other books. So he contacted me and says, you know, I'm a big fan and be interested in writing a book on you and this and that. And, you know, just by the grace of God, I was going to be in Germany working with Vitaly 2 weeks later. So 2 weeks later, we meet, we shake hands. He was a baseball player like me, and we just hit it off. We shook hands and wrote From the Fields to the Garden. And the fields being that I grew up as a farm worker. And my goal was to make it to Madison Square Garden. So we wrote the book, and it became like a #1 seller on Amazon for sports biographies. So that went real well. And then, of course, you know, my life continued, and people were asking about a second book. And, you know, in movies, second movies are never as good as the first, and I wasn't too interested. But then the UFC let me go, and I had a lot more stories. So I woke up one day, and I called Zach, and I said, hey, man, let's do #2. And so we did From the Field to the Garden too. So it just happened.
Can you share that story with UFC? Are you allowed to share the story? Yeah.
What they got to do, fire me?
What happened there? What?
Yeah, but, you know, and I'll give it to you this way is I knew Dana way before the UFC. You know, he's the one that brought me in. So I got to give him props for that. And at that time, it was only Leon Tabbs. Leon Tabbs was the original Cutman from UFC #1. And so they brought me in and kind of started changing my whole life. And we started working with sponsors. So I had sponsors. And I was making more money with sponsors than I was with what the UFC was paying us. So were the fighters. Yeah. So the UFC goes into the Reebok deal. And as we all know, everybody had to get rid of the sponsors. The fighters, trainers, the fans, they're all hating it. Fighters were mad, you know, but they went with the program, and they called the Cutman and say, well, you guys have to get rid of your sponsors, but we can't give you no more additional money. Well, that wasn't going to work for me because I needed the UFC to make money off the sponsors. So John Nash from Bloody Elbow called me and says, would you be interested in doing an interview on how the Reebok deal affected the Cutman? Well, going back as a farm worker, my parents were always against unfair practices, about doing the right things for the farm workers. And, you know, we used to drink out of one a metal can of water, 1 tin cup that was full of dirt, pesticides. You know, they're spraying the pesticides in the orchards next to us, and just unsanitary conditions. So my parents were always trying to make things right. And I figured, you know, if I don't speak up for all of us, then I'm not doing what my parents did, and they would be very proud. So the interview I did was very politically correct. It was just that maybe it was at the bad time because all the dust started settling. Maybe the fire was turning off, and I threw a gallon of gas in it, and it went viral. And I got calls from all over the world, supporting me, fighters, trainers, even staff with the UFC. And yeah, so then I'm at Costco with my wife shopping, and I get a call from one of the guys in the UFC, and we're all friends. And he said, do you have a moment to talk? And I kind of knew what was going on because I'm getting all these calls, all these emails, all these texts. I said, no, give me about an hour. So I get home, and Mark, and he calls me, and his voice is cracking. And the only thing he says is, because of the interview you did about Reebok, the UFC is not going to use you no more. Boom, it was like a slap in the face. So I didn't want to bust his balls because he was a friend of mine. And I said, well, Mark, do me a favor. You tell Dana I said that he don't have no balls, that he should have called me specifically because he's the one that brought me in. And so I'm reading all my messages, and the first text that I read, guy's name is David Estrada. Now I know I said, I want you to be the first to know. The UFC just let me go for speaking out about the Reebok deal. Now I got to look for another job. You know, that went viral. And I'm getting calls from Pride. I'm getting calls from Orsa Zoko, and was CroCop's manager. And I'm getting calls from Bellator and PFL. And so I became the face of the rebellion. And so now I'm back. I got my sponsors, and, you know, it's the best thing ever happened to me.
And you have residual checks from movies. You're doing just fine, Stitch. You're doing just
I'm doing
fine.
okay. Yeah, and I'm at the age now where I'm starting to get Social Security retirement, and I got my retirement from R.J. Reynolds because I was the tobacco company I worked with. I was with them for 23 years. So I'm doing all right. I've been blessed.
What's one more round thing?
One more round is, it's funny that I'm glad you brought that up, because one more round was one of my sponsors. I started off with Tap Out, and then they sold the company, and then one more round. What happened with one more round is Matt Hughes, Mark Zucker, the owner of One More Round, he owned a company, a clothing company called BC Ethics. And he's watching the Balboa movie that I was in, and I didn't even know him. He was watching the Balboa movie where Rocky is telling his son something about, I got to go one more round. And it lit up his thing. I said, you know what? That's a great line, because everybody in life has to go that one more round.
Yeah.
So he created One More Round, and he created some nice shirts. So he got a hold of Matt Hughes, and he sponsored Matt Hughes. And Matt's the one that says, you know what, Mark, if anybody you should get, it's Stitch, because Stitch gives the fighters one more round.
Oh, wow.
So actually, we met here in Las Vegas, and I became one of the One More Round guys that were sponsored, to the point where everybody thought it was my company. And
I still thought, yeah, I thought the same, yeah.
Yeah, everybody thought it was my company, and to the point now where people still yell at me, Stitch, one more round, one more round. So what happened is we lost contact, because the UFC was requiring these guys to pay them like $50,000 to $100,000 if they wanted to sponsor guys in the UFC, TV rights. So he couldn't do it, so he left. So he saw he was watching KSI, all right, the KSI Logan Paul fight, because he was down and out and depressed, and his son says, come on, Dad, let's go look at some fights. So they went out to some friend's house, and he saw me, and he called me the next day. And I always believed in Mark and One More Round. Always believed it. Good guy. I love the logo. I love the clothes. He called me, and it turns out that we teamed up. So the way we teamed up was, I tell you, man, things just happen. is I get, once I teamed up with them, of course, we're going to come up with new designs of clothing and what have you not. And I want to do shirts with buttons instead, because I don't wear T-shirts. I'm too old. I'm not ready for T-shirts. But guys like me, guys like you that have button downs, why not? Like Tommy Bahama type of shirts, right?
Yeah.
But one more round. If you're playing golf, go one more round. If you're doing this, go one. Anyway, if you're drinking, go one more round. So anyway, so he goes and he sees the KSI Logan Paul fight, and he calls me, and we team up. So what happened shortly after that, I get the call to work with Tyson Fury. So when I sat down with Tyson Fury, he introduced himself, and we took pictures, and we talked about the cuts. And then I said, well, Tyson, I have sponsors. And he knew that because of the UFC. I have sponsors now, and I have my own apparel company. Do you mind if I make a tournament jacket to represent your colors and have my sponsors on it? He puts his hand on my shoulder, and he says, Stitch, do whatever you want. And so as you look at the fight, the tournament jacket I have, that's one more round in the back. So every fight that I'm going to work now, I'm going to wear my one more round jacket. And I'm glad you brought that up, man, because it just, by the faith of God, things just happen, and so one more round is back. We relaunched it.
That's great. Congratulations on that. Congratulations.
I'm glad you brought it up, man. Thank you.
And so of all your accomplishments that you've had, and you had quite a few, which one are you proud of the most?
I don't know if anybody's ever asked that. Well, I think, believe it or not, I think when the UFC let me go, I spoke out about unfair practices. I think that has to be my most honorable moment because I did it for myself. But see, I always took care of the other Cutmen. Whenever I got sponsors, like one more round, I said, okay, Mark, let's negotiate this deal for me, but let's do the billboard effect. Let's sponsor these Cutmen. So I always made money for these guys. So when I was talking, I did the interview. I did it regarding protecting the Cutman, supporting them. But it seemed out that I supported the whole MMA industry, and so I think of all things that has to fall as one of my proudest, most memorable moments, and I'm glad I did it. People ask me, "Have you seen Dana? Have you talked to Dana?" I said, "No, I haven't talked to Dana. I haven't seen him." But if I do see him, I'll shake his hand and I said, "Thanks for letting me go. It's the best thing ever happened to me." You know, so that has to be my proudest moment. Yeah. But and growing up, I grew up in a small town, all farm workers, all very low income farm workers. I go back home, I'm like the big shit, because of what I've done, and I never forget where I come from, and then I spoke out about unfair practices. So that has to be my proudest moment. Good question. Nobody's ever asked that.
You're very busy. You have a lot going on. The fights. You have a sponsorship. You in movies, but you're also a family man. How do you able to balance everything?
Yeah, I'm 100% family man. I'm not a partier. I don't go party. I don't go drinking and all that. And it's not as bad as it would seem. That's why this lockdown is pretty normal for me, because my job is normally on the weekends. So if I got a fight, let's say in Canada, United States, or Mexico, I'll leave Friday because it's a short flight. I'll get there on Friday. I'll do the fight Saturday. I come home Sunday. Monday through Thursday, I ain't doing shit. I'm still home with my family. We'll go to the movies or something like that. But everything I do for my family. I don't have jewelry. I'm not bling bling. And, it's not about me wearing all this stuff. It's me about taking care of my family, being a family man. But, that's everything I do for my family and everything, so I'm just lucky to be doing this. And you have to have a good wife to support doing what you do. And I remember when I first moved to Las Vegas, my brother lives here also. And he came to my house and my wife was crying, and he thought that we'd gotten into a fight, but we couldn't pay our rent. I had just gotten to Las Vegas. So he lent me some money. And from there, I never looked back. I paid him back, and I never looked back. But that was a low point in my life that he took me out of that, and haven't stopped since. So in doing that, I even help guys out. I always give back, because to me, it's never been about money. It's been that I'm glad that I got a nice house. I'm glad I have a nice family. I'm glad that I got food on the table. But if I could help somebody of my friends, then it's done. Like I have a maintenance guy that comes by my house, and it's $100 job. I'll give him 300, because I know he needs it more than I do. So.
You're a very honorable man. I could tell by looking at you. By the way, it's just random stuff. I saw one picture of you without mustache, and I didn't recognize you. I'm like, he looks very different. A different guy.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Okay. Back to interviews.
Let's talk about the mustache.
Okay,
I did it on. I've never taken my mustache off, and I'll never do it again. This was like on Valentine's. But I'm in the shower. My wife challenged me. Well, anyway, you challenged me. I'm going to take you up on that challenge. I cut it off, and I'll never do it again. So,
yeah. You look recognizable. It's interesting. Like, it's not like it's...
Oh, bro, it's not me. I've had this. No, it's never good. My hair, my glasses, and my mustache are my trademark.
I think so, too. I just realized that after seeing that picture. So, I have a quick blitz with you. I'm going to ask you a question, and you give me a quick answer, whatever comes to your mind first, okay? So what's your favorite movie?
No, you know what? Major League was one of them. Shawshank Redemption was another one. I've seen, that's probably, Shawshank Redemption probably falls number one. I've seen it 10, 15 times.
Fantastic movie. Who's your favorite movie star?
I don't know. It'd have to be Sylvester Stallone, of course.
What's your favorite song?
Oye Como Va, Carlos Santana.
Oh, you like Santana? Oh, you kind of look like him a little bit too, by the way.
Well, can I tell you a story with Santana, with Vanderlei Silva? No, yeah. With
how do you get Santana and Vanderlei Silva in one sentence?
Yeah. Well, no, here's what happened is, I'm wrapping his hands, right? Well, when I went to Japan for Pride, the Brazilians, Shogun, Vanderlei, they all gave me the nickname Verdun Santana, right? So I'm wrapping Vanderlei's hands one day, and I'm telling him the story of that. He's, oh yeah, you are Carlos Santana. You are Carlos Santana. So the Brazilians know me as Santana. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, if you put a hat on, you look like him quite a bit.
It happens all the time.
What's your favorite place to visit?
Uh, I don't know. It's Rio de Janeiro. I think is of all the places I've been throughout the world, Rio de Janeiro to me is the best.
What's your favorite sport to watch?
Of course, it's combat sports, man.
Which
I don't
one?
watch nothing else.
Which one?
I think boxing overall will still take it. Bare knuckle fights, though, I can't say I watch it because I'm working it. But if I wasn't working bare knuckle fights, it'd probably be bare knuckle fights. But all combat sports, and it's funny because the baseball, football, basketball, the main sports, I'm always traveling on Sundays, so I never really get a chance to see them. But combat sports for sure.
What's the first item on your bucket list?
Yeah, I've parachute. I've gotten stunned, a stun gun. That was a thing. I've gotten checked by a dog. That was another thing. But I think I'd like to challenge parachuting.
Well, you want to challenge gravity. Okay, good. Well,
Yeah.
hopefully it goes fine. So I have a last question for you, Stitch.
Yeah, me too. I hope it goes fine.
Yeah, you need a good Cutman if it doesn't. What's your life advice for young people who are watching this interview?
I always say, I always follow my own motto is, I always tell people is to follow your dreams because they do come true. I'm no different than you. I'm no different than anybody else. I was a young kid that grew up as a farm worker that had dreams. But the most important thing is we've all been there. You have your own podcast. I'm sure when you started it, you were nervous, you were scared. But if you don't cross that line, you'll never get to the other side. So, that's why that company, One More Round, is so important to me because all instill in you is never quit and always go one more round.
Stitch, thank you for your time. I appreciate this interview, and thank you for being responsive and finding time to jump on the call.
No, it was a pleasure, man. And let's do it again. I still got a shitload of stories, bro.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, let's do Stitch 2.
Whenever you want, man. You do a good job. Keep it up, and then we'll do it again.